You
All right,
are
great.
good to go. You have the stage.
Thank you. My name is Albert. Some of you might know me as Albert That's the username I tend to use online. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge studying the evolution of birds, which will be the subject of my talk today. And in reference to my title, I don't think it'll be news to anyone listening today that birds are a type of dinosaur. This is something that has become increasingly well known, and it's even made its way into pop culture. In the time that I've been alive, I've seen this show up increasingly in popular works like educational shows for children and anime and webcomics. So it's something that I think the general public is becoming increasingly familiar with, and not just people like us who are really into paleontology or evolutionary biology. And quite rightly so, because over the last few decades, a lot of evidence has accumulated to support this idea that birds are dinosaurs. And indeed, just about every aspect of bird biology that we can observe in the fossil record, we have evidence of how it transitioned in the line leading to birds, often originating in non-bird dinosaurs originally. And this is a topic that I would say we don't know everything about, of course, but it is certainly one of the best studied and best understood evolutionary transitions in vertebrate history. And it's certainly a topic that I'm very interested in, this whole transition from non-bird dinosaurs to birds. However, most of my research and most of what my talk will focus on today is going to be on essentially what happened to birds after they became birds. So my research mostly focuses on what we call modern birds or crown birds. So what does that mean? Well, the closest living relatives of birds today, believe it or not, are crocodilians. And we're very sure about this, like all the genetics and anatomy and even behaviors support this. But of course, it is very easy in the modern day to pick out what is a bird versus what is a crocodilian. They're very easy to tell apart. And pretty much everybody would agree that a crocodilian is not a bird. But if we go to the fossil record, there were a whole range of animals, such as the non-bird dinosaurs especially, that share features with modern birds that are not seen in crocodilians. And we know that they're more closely related to birds than to anything else alive today. So where do we draw a line and say something is a modern bird? Well, what a modern bird is essentially the last common ancestor of all living types of birds, as shown on this simplified phylogeny. Of course, this isn't every bird that is alive today, it's just a sample. But the last common ancestor of all living birds and all of its descendants are what we call crown group birds or modern birds. So here, for example, we have a terror bird that is extinct, but because it is a descendant of the last common ancestor of all living species of birds, it is also a crown bird, and we would expect it to have all the features that we see shared among all modern species of birds. So, that's what a modern bird is. But when did this modern bird group appear in evolutionary history? And that turns out to be something that is quite contentious. Now, the modern bird group is also called Neornithes, so if you say Neornithes, that means the same thing as crown birds. The oldest known fossil that pretty much we all agree is a crown bird is this fossil called Vegavis. That's actually known from several specimens, but this is the original holotype. And it's about 69 million years old, so it's not too far away from the end of the Cretaceous, which, as you probably know, is about 66 million years old. But, of course, the fossil record is incomplete, so just because this is the oldest known fossil we have of this group, that doesn't mean it is the oldest one that ever existed, right? So how do we know how much older modern birds might be? Well, one method to try and figure this out, since we have modern birds alive to study, is to use a method called the molecular clock. What this is you take genetic sequences or protein sequences from living organisms, or recently extinct ones, and essentially, this is a very, very simplified explanation, but you compare the differences between the sequences of different species, and then run an analysis to try and estimate how much time is required to accumulate those differences. And people have tried running molecular clock estimates on modern birds. So there have been quite a few studies. Here are some examples of recent ones. So, for example, in 2015, a very influential study suggested modern birds originated about 72 million years ago, which is not that far off from the oldest fossil that we have, at least in geologic terms. But we also have older estimates, like 89 million years, 93, 94, 100. Now we're like at the beginning of the late Cretaceous now. And there are even older ones that go into the early Cretaceous, one that was relatively recent, even out of 130 million years ago, even older than that. Here's a pretty early one that just kind of went off the scale. Like it put modern birds all the way back in the Jurassic. And even the authors of that paper said, yeah, that's probably not right. But even discounting that, you can see that there's this whole range of estimates here. So it's pretty hard for us to pinpoint exactly when modern birds originated. Why is this the case? Well, there are a number of factors that influence molecular clock estimates. So molecular clock estimates, we can't assume that the rates of molecular evolution in different groups of organisms all happen at the same rates. And furthermore, we can't expect them to stay constant over time. And so to run molecular clock estimates, what we often have to do is we have to apply calibrations to them. So we have to use other lines of evidence that give us direct information about how old these lineages are. So we said that the oldest known crown bird fossil was about 69 million years old. So we will tell the analysis you have to make crown birds at least 69 million years old and no younger than that. So use that fossil as a calibration. But to use things as calibrations, you have to be pretty sure that this fossil, for example, is actually a member of the group. Otherwise, you'll just get unreliable results. And in some early attempts to estimate the age of crown birds, that's kind of what we saw. So this is a group of birds called the New Zealand wrens on this slide. They're not really wrens like you would see in Europe and Asia or the Americas. They are the closest living relatives to all other what we call passerine birds. That's a big group of birds that includes like songbirds and their close relatives. And they're only found in New Zealand today. So people, when they tried to estimate the age of passerines, they would go, okay, so let's use the age of when New Zealand split from the other continents to estimate when passerines originated. And that happened in the Cretaceous. So people would be like, whoa, there are Cretaceous passerines. But then, other people pointed out that birds can fly, right? So just because that's when the continents separated doesn't mean that's when those lineages separated. They could have flown to other continents after the separation. And now New Zealand wrens are not very good flyers, which is probably why people assume that they couldn't, but that doesn't mean their ancestors were. And so those older estimates now are not considered particularly trustworthy. And also there are changes in the rates of molecular evolution. So here's a graph from a study done by my former PhD supervisor and one of his colleagues, where they found that if you use only small-bodied birds to estimate molecular clock analyses, you end up with like older age estimates because small-bodied animals have faster rates of genetic mutations in general and reproduce faster. And so if that's not something that you can take into account in the analysis will say, oh, there are all these different mutations. They must be older, when in reality it just happened faster. And so because of all these different factors, molecular clock analyses can be pretty tricky to run. Nonetheless, we do largely agree that modern birds must have originated at some point in the Cretaceous and probably the late Cretaceous. This is a basic family tree of the living groups of modern birds. The paleonates are the ostrich-like birds, those things like emus and rheas and such are all members of this group. Galliformes are chicken-like birds, and Anseriformes are duck-like birds. Together they form a clade called Galloanseri, they're close relatives, and everybody else belongs to this last clade, Neoaves. And pretty much most recent molecular clocks agree that by the end of the Cretaceous, at least 3, probably 4 of these lineages had split from one another. And this means that now modern birds survived the end Cretaceous mass extinction that wiped out all the other dinosaurs. And how did they manage this? Well, there are a few different factors that might be at play. Maybe they just got lucky. That's something that we can't really reject. But that's also not something we can really scientifically test. So it is worth thinking about whether there are other factors at play, and there probably are. First of all, they're a lot smaller than most other dinosaurs, right? And one of the main killing agents during the end Cretaceous was this big asteroid that slammed down into the Earth and threw up a lot of debris into the atmosphere covering the sun. Or rather blocking out the sunlight, which would have disrupted food chains. And so animals that required a lot of food probably would have mostly starved to death during this time if they survived even the initial destruction. Now, modern birds do have to eat quite a bit to sustain their high metabolisms, but in terms of the absolute amount of food that they would require, it's probably still less than, say, a T-Rex or a Triceratops would need. So this probably was something that helped them survive during this time. And additionally, being smaller means you can find shelter more easily, you can hide in burrows, hollow trees, or under rocks and such. And so during the initial destruction, when debris rained down from the atmosphere, creating heat, anything that was hit by the burning debris would have basically been roasted alive. But if you were small enough to actually happen to be taking shelter at the time, then potentially that could have helped you survive that initial wave of destruction. And of course, modern birds can fly, so if one area doesn't have food, then potentially they could fly off to somewhere else where there might be a little bit more food. So all of these are factors that certainly might have helped them get through. But that's really just half of the equation, right? Because modern birds, well, large dinosaurs were not the only things that died out during the end of the Cretaceous. There were also lots of birds or lots of dinosaurs that are very similar to modern birds that also died out, like this group, the Enantiornithes, also known as the opposite birds. And these opposite birds were, as far as we know, they seem to have been a lot more abundant at the end of the Cretaceous than modern birds were, and they came in they were within the size range that we would see in modern birds, like from the size of a sparrow to the size of an eagle. And if you just saw a living one of these just casually and didn't take a good look at it, you'd probably just assume, yeah, that's a bird. You wouldn't really question it. So why did these die out and modern birds survive? That's a very good question. Well, there are a number of factors that have also been suggested to try and explain this. Here are just a few examples. One is that modern birds don't have any teeth, whereas most of the Enantiornithes did. And it's been suggested that this would have helped modern birds be better adapted for feeding on seeds, because they could crack the seeds open with their beaks. And also modern birds seem to have better developed gizzards as well, which would have also helped with that. And seeds would have been some of the few food sources that would have been around in the wake of that big end Cretaceous mass extinction. Something else is that Enantiornithes mostly appear to have been very specialized for living in trees, like the feet of the foot anatomy is very well adapted to perching. And we know that during the end of the Cretaceous, or at least we have evidence that forests were greatly destroyed at that time, probably because of the raining kind of burning debris that kind of burned up the forests and started a lot of forest fires. So things that depended on trees probably did not have a good time during the end Cretaceous mass extinction. But if we take living birds, there are a lot of living birds that live in trees, of course, but if you try to estimate what their last common ancestor would have been like, it was probably a bird that primarily lived on the ground. And that doesn't mean it couldn't fly, it almost certainly could, but it was something that was probably feeding a lot and moving around a lot on the ground, so it didn't depend on trees to nest in or to feed in, and probably this would have been something that helped modern birds survive when the more forest-dependent Enantiornithes did not. However, a lot of these ideas are based on observations of living birds, so they're kind of inferences that we make from looking at living birds, because the evidence of modern birds, like direct fossil evidence of modern birds at the end of the Cretaceous, is very scarce. So we had Vegavis, and that was about it. And Vegavis appears to have been some sort of weird diving bird, and we don't have a lot of its skull, so we don't know what its beak looked like, for example. So we didn't really have any information about what late Cretaceous modern birds were like in that regard. During my PhD, my supervisor became very interested in this specimen shown here. So this little block of rock, we could tell that there was something that looked like a bird bone exposed on the surface, and really we weren't expecting much when we decided to study this specimen. We were just like, okay, a kind of bird-like fossil from the end of the Cretaceous. This thing is about 67 million years old. It was found in Belgium in the Maastricht Formation. So we'll take a look at it, and if there's anything interesting, we'll just write it up quickly. It'll be a simple project. Now, this is very small. You can see the scale bar is 5 centimeters. It's smaller than a pack of playing cards. So it would have been very risky to try and dig those bones out from the rock. Instead, we decided to CT scan it, and this was what we found. A lot of colorful language was used when we first saw this. So we had a nearly complete skull of a modern bird, and this is a very characteristic modern bird skull in this rock. So late Cretaceous, nearly complete modern bird skull is basically unprecedented. And so we did write this up. It ended up being published in Nature. We named it as a new species, Asteriornis maastrichtensis. Based on the structure of its skull, it's probably closely related to both the chicken-like and duck-like birds. It might be an early member of the chicken-like lineage or an early member of the duck-like lineage, or just outside of both. It's hard to tell. In fact, its skull basically looks a little bit, in some ways, like what you'd get if you mashed a chicken skull and a duck skull together. It's a lot smaller than a domestic duck or a barnyard chicken, or at least an average one of either of those species. It's less than 400 grams, so it's about the size of like a partridge or a small wild duck. In addition to the skull, we do have some bones from its hind limbs that suggest it had pretty long hind limbs for its size. This would be characteristic of a ground-dwelling bird, not a tree-dwelling one. And the shape of its beak suggests it had a pretty generalized diet, so it could probably eat a little bit of everything. Seeds, vegetation, insects, any of those would probably have been fair game. And so this is a bird that confirms that there were modern birds at the end of the Cretaceous that were small, terrestrial, and pretty omnivorous. And of course, this is just one specimen, so it doesn't demonstrate that this was how modern birds survived the end Cretaceous extinction, but it does show that modern birds with those qualities were alive at the time. And so here's a paleoartistic reconstruction showing you what Asteriornis might have looked like. For the last part of my talk, let's zoom in on this group over here, Neo-aves. This includes 95% of all living birds. Basically anything that's not an ostrich-like bird or a chicken-like bird or a duck-like bird belongs to Neo-aves. And the problem with Neo-aves is that we're not really sure what their phylogeny is like. So over the past decade or so, there have been a ton of genetic studies done on modern birds, and here are some of the results of these different studies. And as you can see, there's basically no agreement whatsoever between the different studies about how neo-avians are related. They do agree that neo-avians come in like these 9 or so major groups, but not how these groups are arranged relative to each other. Now, if you absolutely had to make me guess, I would guess that the most recent study, Stiller et al. 2024, pictured on the right here, is probably closest to the true bird tree. But even then, they still admitted that there are some parts of this tree that we can't really be sure about. So yeah, it's still very much of a toss-up. And this is kind of crazy, right? Because birds are some of the most well-studied animal groups ever. And we have entire genomes of these living bird species, but we still can't agree on whether a penguin is more closely related to a gull or to a hummingbird. So why is this the case? Why is this so hard? Well, it turns out that all these studies do agree that the different neo-avian groups probably separated from each other in a very, very short amount of time. And when did this happen? Well, there is some disagreement about the timing, but most recent studies suggest that it was probably right around or just after the end Cretaceous mass extinction, which would make a lot of sense, because that would have been like a basically empty world where most of their competitors had been wiped out, and they could diversify into a massive array of forms. And so because of this, there's very little time for the closely related groups to accumulate shared features in either their genetic sequences or their anatomy to inform us about which groups are most closely related. Now, I'm a paleontologist, so what do fossils have to tell us about this? Fossils are, I would say, essential for helping us understand the evolution of modern birds, because first of all, they provide those calibration points for those molecular clock analyses I mentioned earlier. They provide an independent test of phylogenetic hypotheses, because if the genetic studies don't agree, sometimes we can use features from the fossils to inform us which ideas about phylogeny are more likely than others. And furthermore, they can help us understand morphological evolution. So we know from studying modern birds that swifts and hummingbirds, even though they look very different, are very closely related, and that's something we all agree on. There's no controversy about that. But we would not be able to determine just from modern birds alone whether the last common ancestor of a swift was more like a swift or more like a hummingbird. But we can get some data on that from the fossil record. So this fossil here is an Eocene fossil from Western North America called Eosipsalis. It's so well preserved that it even has the feathers preserved, and it seems to have been very similar to the last common ancestor of both swifts and hummingbirds. Swifts and hummingbirds today have very similar wing skeletons, but very different wing feathers. Swifts have much longer wing feathers proportionately. Hummingbirds have much shorter wing feathers, more triangular-shaped wings, and Eosipsalis suggests that their last common ancestor had a wing that was something in between, and that's something that we could only get if we had the fossil record to inform us, or we could only get from the fossil record. And here's Paragornis, which is a little bit younger, but also from the Eocene of Germany. It seems to have been a little bit closer to hummingbirds and to swifts, and you can see that its wing feathers are a little bit shorter, so more kind of closer to the hummingbird proportions. However, its head still looks a lot like a swift's head, so this suggests that hummingbirds first evolved their specialized wing anatomy before they evolved their specialized nectar-feeding beak. And so now, this is my final slide. So I've gone over very briefly some of the major questions that we have regarding bird evolution, and these are all still pretty controversial questions that we're still working very hard on, like when did modern birds appear, how they survived the end Cretaceous mass extinction, and how they're all related to one another. But we have made a lot of great progress in the last several decades, especially the last decade, and more refined methods incorporating genetics and fossil data will likely narrow down the possible answers to these questions, and that has a lot to do with what I'm working on now. So yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks for listening. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have, either here or in the chat. Thank you.